I arrived at Pine Ridge Cemetery 15 minutes late, snow crunching under my worn boots as I walked toward the small gathering around Walter Bennett's grave. My grandfather's funeral was everything he would have hated. Formal, cold, and strangely devoid of the stories that had defined his 78 years. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my breath forming small clouds that disappeared faster than my childhood memories had. My father Nathan stood rigid beside the casket, accepting condolences with practiced nods. When our eyes met across the mourners, his gaze slid past me like I was just another stranger paying respects. 28 years old, and I was still invisible to him. "Eli?" My mother Charlotte approached with that familiar, guilt-ridden expression she'd worn for 15 years. Her hug was brief, tense. "I'm glad you came. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." But she wasn't glad. None of them were. I could see it in the way conversations paused when I walked by, in the careful distance everyone maintained. I was the prodigal son who'd never actually left, just been pushed so far to the edges that I might as well have disappeared. After the service, I found myself alone at Walter's grave. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, Grandpa," I whispered to the fresh earth. A memory surfaced. Walter and me by his fireplace when I was 12, him teaching me to read topographical maps. "Every line tells a story, Eli. The land doesn't lie like people do." The will reading took place in Morrison and Associates, a cramped office above the hardware store. Nathan sat across from me while the lawyer shuffled through documents. "Mr. Walter Bennett leaves his house and property to his son, Nathan Bennett. His savings account totaling $47,000, also to Nathan Bennett. Small bequests to the Pine Ridge Historical Society and Colorado Conservation Fund." The lawyer folded the will. "That concludes the reading." I waited. My name would come up eventually. Walter had to have left me something. "What about me?" I finally asked. Nathan's voice cut like winter wind. "He left you nothing, Eli. Nothing at all." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd prepared for disappointment, but being erased completely? Being forgotten so thoroughly that my name didn't appear anywhere? "I don't understand. We were close once." "You were a child," Nathan interrupted. "People say things to children. You can't build your life around the fantasies of a lonely old man." I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. I was 28 years old, a struggling artist and substitute teacher living paycheck to paycheck in Denver, and the one person I'd thought might throw me a lifeline had apparently forgotten I existed. I sat in my rental car outside the law office for 20 minutes, hands shaking too badly to start the engine. The humiliation burned worse than the Colorado cold. How had I gotten it so wrong? A knock on my passenger window made me jump. A Latina woman in her 60s stood in the snow, her dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Anita Morales," she said when I rolled down the window. "I was a friend of your grandfather's. Would you mind coming with me? There's something Walter wanted me to give you." At the Pine Ridge Cafe, Anita ordered coffee for both of us and studied me with sharp eyes that reminded me of Walter's. "You look like him. Same stubborn jawline, same eyes that see too much." She reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope, weathered and sealed with red wax. My name was written across it in Walter's familiar handwriting. He gave me this 6 months ago with very specific instructions. If Nathan tried to exclude you from his legacy, I was to find you and give you this. Inside was a small brass key and a single sheet of paper. "Eli, if you're reading this, it means Nathan did exactly what I feared he would do. I'm sorry, son. This key opens Safety Deposit Box 247 at First National Bank. What's inside isn't money. You don't need an old man's money to make your way in the world. What's inside is something more important, the truth. I owed you more than stories by the fire. I'm sorry. This is for you. Find what I couldn't say while I was alive. All my love, Grandpa Walter." I read the letter 3 times before looking up at Anita, who was watching me with determination. "Walter loved you," she said, "maybe more than anyone in that family, and he was heartbroken when Nathan forced him to cut ties with you." "Forced him?" "Your father gave Walter an ultimatum when you were 13. Stay away from Eli, or lose contact with the entire family forever." Anita's eyes flashed with old anger. "Walter felt like he had no choice. But he never stopped thinking about you." Quote, First National Bank's basement vault hummed with fluorescent lights as I followed Janet, the bank employee, to box 247. Inside was a leather-bound journal, a folded map, and a sealed envelope marked, "For Eli, only when you're ready." In the private room, I opened Walter's journal. His voice seemed to rise from the pages. "Day 1 of retirement. Finally have time to write down the stories I've been carrying. Starting with the truth about this family. Because somebody needs to remember what really happened." The entries were dated over 5 years, a mixture of memoir and love letter to the Colorado wilderness. But scattered throughout were references to me. "Eli caught 3 trout today using flies we tied together. The boy has patience I never had at his age. Nathan doesn't appreciate what he has in that son. Nathan forbade me from taking Eli camping anymore. Says the boy needs to focus on practical skills. I think Nathan's afraid Eli will turn out like me. Too independent, too honest, too willing to choose principle over profit." Near the back, a detailed drawing of a cabin surrounded by aspen trees, marked with careful measurements and compass bearings. The map showed a trail starting from Cascade Falls and winding deep into the national forest. X's marked specific landmarks: a lightning-struck pine, a beaver dam, a rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear. At the trail's end, another X marked home. A memory surfaced. The last time I'd seen Walter, I was 13, standing in our kitchen, while Nathan and Walter shouted in the living room. I caught fragments. "My son. Interference. Choose. Never again." Walter had left without saying goodbye. But what if Nathan had lied? What if the man who'd taught me to read maps and identify bird calls had been forced to walk away? I should have driven back to Denver. Instead, I found myself at Morrison's Outdoor Supply, buying camping gear. The trail to Cascade Falls was easier than I remembered. But once I began following Walter's hand-drawn map, the going got rough. The path was barely visible, marked by occasional cairns and subtle trail blazes. I found the lightning-struck pine after 2 hours, its trunk split and blackened but still standing like a monument to survival. According to the map, I needed to head northwest, following a creek bed to the beaver dam. My legs ached and my lungs burned in the thin air. I wasn't the 12-year-old who could keep up with Walter's steady mountain pace anymore. But as the day wore on, something started coming back. The way Walter had taught me to place my feet, how to read the landscape, when to rest, and when to push through discomfort. I found the beaver dam as the sun began its descent. The pond behind it was partially frozen, and I could see the V-shaped wake of a beaver swimming under the ice. Walter had loved moments like this, wildlife going about its business, oblivious to human observation. I made camp beside the pond, studying the map by headlamp. The rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear should be another 2 miles ahead, and beyond that, the X that marked Walter's secret. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I dreamed of being 12 again, following Walter through these same forests. In the dream, he was telling me something important, but when I tried to understand his words, they kept shifting like leaves in the wind. The sleeping bear formation was unmistakable. 3 massive boulders stacked into a shape that looked exactly like a bear curled up for winter hibernation. Walter's map indicated a game trail heading east, marked by a cairn with a white quartz capstone. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was more substantial than I'd expected, a real log structure with a stone chimney and covered porch, not some primitive shelter. Inside, everything was preserved as if Walter had just stepped out. A fire was laid in the fireplace. Kerosene lamps sat ready on wooden tables, and shelves lined the walls filled with books and maps. And everywhere, photographs, dozens of them, most of me. I moved through the cabin in a daze, recognizing images from camping trips I'd half forgotten. Me at 8, holding up a trout. Me at 10, standing next to Walter beside a mountain peak. Me at 12, concentrating as I learned to tie fishing flies. On the mantelpiece, a framed sketch caught my attention, a portrait of me at around 11, sitting by a campfire reading. Beneath it, in Walter's handwriting, my real legacy. I found a newer journal lying open on the desk. I finished the cabin today. Took me 3 years working weekends and pretending to Nathan that I was just taking nature walks. It's not much, but it's mine. More importantly, it's a place where I can think about Eli without Nathan's disapproval poisoning the memories. Maybe Nathan's right to be afraid. Maybe I would teach Eli that success isn't measured by bank accounts. Maybe I would show him that a man can live simply and still have a rich life. Is that such a terrible thing? Near the back, an entry dated 3 months before Walter's death. The doctor says I don't have long. I've been thinking about what to do with this place, with all these memories I've been hoarding. This cabin was built for Eli, even if I never got to bring him here while I was alive. Maybe this is how I finally give him what Nathan stole from us. Time together, stories shared, the feeling of being known and loved. I opened the sealed envelope with trembling hands. My dear grandson, your father threatened to take the entire family away if I didn't stay away from you. He said if I wanted to be part of the family, I had to respect his authority and stop undermining his efforts to raise you properly. I was 76, Eli. I'd just lost your grandmother. The thought of losing you two was more than I could bear. So I made a devil's bargain. I traded depth for breadth, love for mere presence. Nathan was afraid of what I represented to you, the possibility that a man could live differently, value different things. He was afraid you'd choose my path over his. This cabin is proof that love doesn't die just because it's forbidden to express itself. Every board I cut, I was thinking of you. This place exists because you existed, because you mattered to someone even when that someone couldn't tell you so. Use it well, grandson. Break the cycle of fear and control that has poisoned our family for too many generations. All my love, all my regret, all my hope for your future, Grandpa Walter. Under loose floorboards beside the fireplace, I found a wooden box containing my first fishing rod, hand-tied flies we'd made together, and a photograph I'd never seen. Walter and me sitting on the cabin's porch, both reading books, completely comfortable in each other's presence. For the first time since Walter's funeral, I cried. Not bitter tears of abandonment, but something deeper and more healing. I cried for the grandfather who'd loved me enough to build a shrine to our relationship, for the boy who'd grown up thinking he wasn't worth fighting for, and for all the years we'd lost to Nathan's fear. I couldn't keep this discovery to myself. I needed to talk to someone who'd known Walter, and one name kept coming to mind, Jonah Green. I found him at Pine Ridge Elementary, where he taught 4th grade. "Holy shit, Eli Bennett!" he exclaimed when he saw me, then caught himself and glanced at his students. Holy cow. After dismissing his class, we went to Murphy's pub. I told him everything. The will reading, Anita's envelope, the safety deposit box, and finally, the cabin. Jonah listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. "I always wondered what happened between you and Walter," he said when I finished. "One day you were practically joined at the hip, then suddenly you never mentioned him anymore. You knew Walter pretty well, didn't you?" "Better than most people realized. He used to speak to my environmental science class every spring, and he was one of the founding members of the Pine Ridge Land Trust." Jonah leaned forward. "Your grandfather was instrumental in preserving about 2,000 acres of wilderness around Pine Ridge. Spent the last 20 years fighting developers who wanted to turn the foothills into ski resorts. Nathan never mentioned any of that. I'm not surprised. Your father was on the opposite side of most fights. He was always pushing for development, arguing that the town needed tourism revenue. Jonah studied his beer. Walter and Nathan had some pretty heated public disagreements about land use over the years. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. That's what they were fighting about. Not just me, but the whole question of what Pine Ridge should become. Walter believed in preservation. Nathan believed in progress, at least the profitable kind. Jonah met my eyes. I think Nathan saw Walter's influence on you as part of a larger threat. If the next generation grew up valuing wilderness over wealth, what would happen to his vision of Pine Ridge's future? We spent 3 days piecing together Walter's conservation legacy, reading through meeting minutes and interviewing longtime residents. What emerged was a picture of a man who dedicated the last decades of his life to preserving what made Pine Ridge special. Your grandfather was playing the long game, Jonah explained as we stood on a ridge overlooking pristine forest. He couldn't stop all development, so he focused on preserving the most critical areas. He was thinking 50 years ahead. That evening, I knew I couldn't postpone the inevitable. I had to confront Nathan with what I'd learned. I found him at my childhood home. Charlotte answered the door, her face immediately tightening with anxiety. Eli, I thought you'd gone back to Denver. I need to talk to Dad. Nathan appeared in the hallway, his expression hardening when he saw me. What do you want? I held up Walter's journal. I want to talk about this. We sat in the same kitchen where Walter had once told me stories. I laid the journal on the table. I found Grandpa's cabin. I read his letters. I know what really happened. Nathan's jaw clenched. You don't know anything. I know you forced him to choose between me and the rest of the family. I know you threatened to move everyone away if he didn't stay out of my life. He was filling your head with nonsense about living in the woods instead of focusing on your future. He was loving me. The words came out louder than I intended. He was the only person in this family who ever saw me as more than a disappointment. Nathan's face flushed. You were always his favorite. Nothing I did was ever good enough because he only had eyes for his precious grandson. So you destroyed our relationship out of jealousy? Charlotte had been silent in the corner, but now she spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. Nathan told Walter if he didn't remove you from the will, he'd never see any of us again. Nathan whirled on her. Charlotte! No. She stood up, tears streaming down her face. I'm tired of the lies. I'm tired of watching what we did to that boy eat away at all of us. She turned to me. Your grandfather never wanted to cut you out, Eli. Nathan made him choose between you and everyone else. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw not a villain but a deeply insecure man driven by fear. Why wasn't there room for both of us in his love? Nathan's shoulders sagged. Because there was never room for both of us anywhere. He was always bigger than life, always right, always the hero. I couldn't compete with that. I stood slowly, surprisingly calm. Thank you for finally telling me the truth. As I walked toward the door, Nathan called after me. Where are you going? To honor him the way you never would. I returned to the cabin and began documenting everything, photographing Walter's journals, mapping his conservation work, cataloging the photographs and artifacts he'd preserved. With Jonah's help, I researched the legal status of the land and discovered Walter had been quietly working with the Forest Service to establish the area as a protected wilderness study area. The cabin sat on public land, which meant Nathan couldn't claim it even if he'd wanted to. Walter had been more clever than I'd realized. He'd built our sanctuary in a place where it would be safe from family politics. I wrote a letter to the Pine Ridge Gazette about Walter's conservation legacy, describing his vision for sustainable development and his role in preserving the watershed that supplied the town's drinking water. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of people came forward with their own Walter Bennett stories, memories of a man who'd quietly fought to protect what they all loved about their home. A week later, Charlotte sent me a package containing a photograph I'd never seen. Walter and me when I was about 7, both of us covered in mud and grinning at the camera after a particularly adventurous hike. On the back, she'd written, I'm sorry we let fear win over love. He talked about you every day until he died. Jonah helped organize a memorial exhibit at the Pine Ridge Historical Society, showcasing Walter's maps, photographs, and conservation work. The opening drew the largest crowd the little museum had ever seen. Standing in front of Walter's topographical maps and wilderness photographs, surrounded by people who'd finally been given permission to celebrate his life, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just Walter's grandson anymore. I was the keeper of his legacy, the one who would make sure his vision lived on. 6 months after I first opened Walter's safety deposit box, I stood backstage at the Colorado Convention Center, my hands trembling as I held the speech I'd written and rewritten a dozen times. The Rocky Mountain Conservation Summit had invited me to speak about Walter's preservation work, but what I really wanted to talk about was something deeper, something that had nothing to do with land use policies and everything to do with what it means to be truly left something. The auditorium was packed with environmental scientists, activists, and policymakers from across the western states. I'd never spoken to a crowd this size, never shared something so personal with strangers, but as I walked onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces, I felt Walter's presence beside me, steady as the mountains he'd loved. "I'm here to tell you about inheritance," I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "Not the kind that comes with legal documents and bank transfers, but the kind that changes everything you thought you knew about what it means to be left something." I told them about a 28-year-old substitute teacher who'd driven to his grandfather's funeral, expecting nothing more than a chance to say goodbye, only to be told that he'd been left nothing at all. I described the humiliation of that moment, the way it felt to be erased so completely from someone's legacy that your name didn't even appear in their will. "But here's what I learned," I continued, finding my rhythm now. "Sometimes when people tell you that you've been left nothing, they're lying. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance is the one that was hidden from those who would have destroyed it." I shared Walter's story then. The secret cabin built over 3 years of stolen weekends, the journals filled with love letters to a grandson he'd been forbidden to see, the photographs preserved like prayers in a wilderness sanctuary. I talked about maps that led not to gold but to truth, about the courage it takes to love someone even when you're not allowed to show it. The audience was silent, leaning forward in their seats. In the front row, I saw a woman wiping her eyes with a tissue. "My grandfather left me a cabin in the woods," I said. "Legally, it belonged to the Forest Service. Financially, it was worth nothing. But emotionally, it was priceless. Because in that cabin, I found something I'd been looking for my entire life. Proof that I mattered to someone. Evidence that I was worthy of being fought for, even if that fight had to happen in secret." I paused, looking out at faces that reflected my own journey back to me. Walter Bennett spent the last 15 years of his life fighting to preserve 2,000 acres of Colorado wilderness. He attended town meetings, lobbied officials, organized letter-writing campaigns. He did it because he believed some things are too valuable to lose, too important to leave to chance. My voice grew stronger. But his greatest act of conservation wasn't saving trees or protecting watersheds. It was preserving love in a place where it could survive family politics, emotional abuse, and the fear of a father who couldn't bear to share his son's affection with anyone else. He built a refuge for our relationship in the one place no one could take it away from us. I felt tears on my cheeks but didn't wipe them away. That cabin taught me that inheritance isn't always about what someone leaves you. Sometimes it's about what they help you find in yourself. My grandfather didn't leave me money or property. He left me the understanding that I was worth building something for, worth fighting for, worth loving, even when that love had to be hidden. The silence stretched for a long moment before someone in the back started clapping. The applause built slowly, then grew into something warm and sustained that seemed to wrap around me like one of Walter's old flannel shirts. After my talk, I was surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories of complicated family legacies and hidden love. But the conversation that meant the most came from a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. "My grandmother and I had a falling out before she died," she said quietly. "Everyone told me she was angry with me, that I'd disappointed her. But your story makes me wonder If maybe there was more to it, maybe she was protecting me from something I didn't understand. I handed her my card. Sometimes the truth is buried deeper than we think, but it's always worth digging for. A year after Walter's funeral, I made my final pilgrimage to the cabin. The Forest Service had officially designated the surrounding area as the Walter Bennett Memorial Wilderness Study Area, and I'd been invited to serve on the advisory committee overseeing its protection. But today wasn't about committees or conservation policies. Today was about saying goodbye. As I hiked the familiar trail, I carried with me a weatherproof box containing Walter's journals, our letters, and my own writings from the past year. Everything someone would need to understand what this place meant and why it had been built. I'd decided it was time to let the cabin tell its own story to whoever might need to hear it. The autumn aspens were brilliant gold against the evergreen backdrop, and the air carried that crisp bite that meant winter wasn't far away. I'd made this hike so many times now that my feet knew every root and rock, every turn and rise. It felt like coming home. But as I approached the clearing, I heard something unexpected. Children's voices, bright with excitement and discovery. I paused at the tree line, not wanting to intrude, and watched a family exploring the cabin's exterior. A father with graying temples was explaining something to his two children, a boy of about 10 and a girl who might have been 8. "Remember what we talked about," the father was saying. "This is a special place. We're just visitors here." The boy was studying the cabin with the same wonder I'd felt the first time I'd seen it. "Dad, who built this? Why is it here?" Before the father could answer, the little girl spotted me at the edge of the clearing. "There's someone there," she announced, pointing in my direction. I stepped forward, raising my hand in greeting. "Sorry to interrupt. I didn't know anyone else was here." The father looked embarrassed. "We weren't going inside or anything. We were just hiking and found this place. The kids were curious." "It's okay," I said, studying the boy's face. There was something familiar in his expression, that same hunger for adventure and belonging that I recognized from my own childhood. "What's your name?" "Miguel," the boy said, his initial shyness giving way to curiosity. "Are you the person who takes care of this place?" I smiled. "I'm one of them. Would you like to know the story of who built it?" The children's eyes lit up, and their father nodded permission. We sat on the cabin's porch, and I told them about Walter Bennett, the forest ranger who'd loved these mountains so much he'd spent his retirement fighting to protect them. I told them about a grandfather and grandson who'd been forced apart but had found a way to stay connected through this hidden sanctuary. "He built this place for love," I explained, watching Miguel absorb every word. "Not the kind of love you see in movies, but the quiet kind that builds things with its hands and preserves them for the future." After the family continued on their hike, promising to visit the new Walter Bennett exhibit at the Pine Ridge Historical Society, I sat alone on the porch and opened the weatherproof box I'd brought. Inside were Walter's original journals, his letters to me, and the story I'd written about finding this place and understanding what inheritance really means. I added one final letter, written that morning in my hotel room. "To whoever finds this place and needs to know they matter. My name is Eli Bennett, and my grandfather built this cabin for me when I was too young to understand that love sometimes has to hide from fear. For 15 years, I thought I'd been abandoned by the one person who'd ever truly seen me. I was wrong. Walter Bennett left me nothing in his will, but he gave me everything that matters. He taught me that some gifts can't be measured in dollars, that some inheritances are worth more than property or bank accounts. He showed me that being left something isn't always about what you can hold in your hands. Sometimes it's about what takes hold of your heart. If you're reading this, you might be like I was, someone who feels forgotten, overlooked, convinced that you don't matter to anyone. I want you to know that this cabin exists because someone once felt that way too, and someone else loved them enough to build a place where that feeling couldn't survive. Take what you need from this story. Leave what you can for the next person who needs to know they're worth fighting for. The land doesn't lie, Walter used to tell me. Neither does love, when you know how to recognize it. Eli Bennett. I sealed the box and placed it in the cabin's main room, positioned where anyone exploring inside would find it. On the outside, I wrote in permanent marker, for the next one who needs to know they are loved. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that Walter would have stopped everything to admire, I sat in his chair one last time. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its evening song, and I thought about legacy. Not the kind that gets divided up by lawyers, but the kind that passes from heart to heart across generations. I wasn't Walter's heir in any legal sense. Nathan had made sure of that. But I was something more valuable. I was the keeper of his true legacy, the one who would make sure his love story didn't end with his death. And now I was passing that responsibility forward, leaving it here in this cabin for the next lost soul, who needed to discover that being abandoned and being protected sometimes look exactly the same from the outside. Walking away from the cabin for the last time, I carried with me the peace that comes from understanding your place in the world. I wasn't just Walter's grandson anymore, wasn't just the boy who'd been left nothing. I was the bridge between his love and the future, the proof that some gifts are too powerful to be contained by wills or family politics, or the small fears of small men. Behind me, hidden in the wilderness Walter had helped preserve, a cabin waited patiently for its next visitor. And in that waiting, love lived on, ready to be discovered by anyone brave enough to follow a map that led not to treasure, but to truth. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.